Muscail, to Muscail, Tusakar Lesh, it's Mr. Fergus Unruchdig, is Tommy and Shaw, Harkun, Glor Namona, stuff Ahas War, Again, and Imak den Sky Shaw Kerr, where Lahar and Actamar Cuds de Ella, Neglegani Gorma, Fia Sahian. It's sure who made the Glord Amona, August Thomasy play and Sean Ack, the Chunskill Orakta, a tugging for Star Canter, August and Slew do Marglue Cuds de Shin. I'm from Unruchdig, I work with Glord Amona, and we have a project at present. A heritage project called Fhathaigh Scathleva under the shadow of the hill, connecting people in place in the Upper Springfield area. We're working on an interactive website about the history of the area. We have an oral history archive, and we're also doing a talk series as part of that. We were derailed for the guts of a year there because of the COVID, and we're really honoured to be able to put this panel at Lahar Act. This is organised as part of Fhathaigh Gorma, which is a local festival that was developed in the year 2017 by a range of community activists in the area. And at the time, there was a feeling that people's heads were a bit down in the area. There was a sense of hopelessness in Canter Eganam. And the thinking was that we could do something positive to try and reconnect people again. And the theme was the mountain and the environment around us. And of course, every May, the bluebells are blossoming at the Hatchet Field, and as kids growing up during the conflict, it was always seen as a sign of hope and a sign of renewal, and it was that image of the joy of life that we were trying to use with the festival, and it's been a great success from that point on. We had outdoor yoga at the top of the mountain last night. We had a fishing trip last night, and we've also had our writers group Scrivenery at Leva. We're practicing their poetry last night, and it's been a fantastic hit. And this evening, we have a guest who is going to be chairing our event. And it just so happened that she's also a creative writer as well. Linda in our masquerade, Igleo Max, she was reading some of her own writing as part of the program. But Linda is a very well-known activist in the climate change world. She works for Friends of the Earth as a development officer. She's also well known for her work in South America, in Peru. And we're greatly honoured that Linda has agreed to chair the panel this evening. So gonna ahead you will you, I'm going to hand you over to Linda. We would ask for people to be on mute during the conversation here, and at the end we'll be able to take some questions in the chat room. So Garamila Moigan, I'm going to pop out now and hand you over to Linda. Garamila Moigan.
All right, thank you, Fergal. Yeah, it's a huge privilege for me to be chairing this event this evening. I'm a big fan of Phil and Negligny Gorma, still on a high from last night's event, sharing poetry and stories and songs with each other, like as the hills and everyone on Facebook Live looked on. So I'm excited about the theme of this evening's discussion. I grew up myself under the protective shadow of Black and Divis Mountain. And to my shame, I only really discovered Cave Hill during last year's lockdown. The Belfast Hills has meant so much to so many people over the years. The remains of ring forts and burial cairns show us just how far back this connection goes. It shows us that our hills were once a sacred place for our ancestors. And probably also back then, as is still the case now, they have been an inspiration for so much creative expression and art. And his column will be sharing with us a sample of his poem later that was inspired by the Belfast Hills. So, but the hills has also been a place where worlds collide. The hills have hosted our human struggles over the years. We've had the British military occupation of Divis Mountain, a symbolic as well as a strategic imposition. And it's also been targeted by extractive capitalism, like quarrying, dumping, and it now sits under the threat of a live petroleum license. Yet in the face of these threats, people have been standing up in defense of our mountains and the life on and around them. Like people like the great Terry Enright, and we'll hear from our speakers of what important work continues today. And underneath it all, really, it's about our relationship with our mountains and by extension, nature herself. So like asking ourselves the question, can we move away from the view that we're separate from and dominant over the other than human world? This view that's brought us the climate and biodiversity crises, and this system that's also brought us the social, economic and health crises that we're also facing. So, just some light topics for this evening then. But I'll stop talking and pass over to our speakers. So just some quick introductions then. We have Jim Bradley with us from the Belfast Hills Partnership.
Yeah.
Hi, Jim. We have Maria Morgan from League and Neil Improvement Association. Hi, Maria. And we have Melina Quinn from the National Trust.
Hi.
And a man who needs no introduction, Gerry Adams, author, hill walker, former president of Sinn Féin and West Belfast MP. So great to have you all with us. And first of all, I'd just like to come to Jim. So Jim, through your work with the Belfast Hills Partnership, can you tell us a bit about the cultural heritage that the hills hold? Like what can you share with us about the historical human interactions with the Belfast Hills?
Right. Well, if you're looking at in particular from an archaeological point of view, actually the Belfast Hills holds a lot of treasures, as you alluded to. In fact, it's specifically if you look at the front of the Black Mountain and you look behind on the slopes behind Quaker's Cottage, there's an ancient flint quarry there, flint factory. Now, whenever I heard it was a flint factory, I assumed that was just a scattering of flints, but that actually dates back to the Neolithic times. And whenever that was dug out, there's about 2 meters of waste from the flint that was found in the limestone. Obviously, the limestone gives the name to the White Rock area of the Black Mountain. So the very first people that were around in and around Belfast after the Ice Age, probably dating right back to maybe 9,000 years ago, they would have been used in the hills in particular as the first places to hunt. They were hunter-gatherers, and they would have used the rivers coming down from the hills to go down to the Lagan. And that's at a time whenever what we know as Belfast today would have been very thick woodland. So there's a tremendous amount of sites that are found in the hills that show evidence of Neolithic hunter-gatherers. And that flint factory that I was talking about, I've heard it said that that's the first human structure, the earliest human structure that we're aware of in and around Belfast. So it goes right back to when the first people arrived here. Then moving on, when you go up to Walk Divis, you think that that's a wonderful natural landscape, but actually we know that used to be light. That started off as light woodland. That would have been hazel woodland. And that was eventually farmed, going right into the Bronze Age. And that was the way they farmed that, the first farmers farmed that actually changed the environment that we have. So all that heather that we see across the Black Mountain and Divis and all the other uplands that we have in Ireland have been formed by people farming. And that actually made that very wet because they used to burn to clear the vegetation. And then they actually moved down when you're coming towards the Iron Age. They moved down into the slopes of the hills. And when you're talking about the Ras, they date from around 1,500 to 1,000 AD. So it's thought that people then moved down after farming up in the hills in what would have been a Mediterranean climate during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages. They moved down to, so that's why we've got this line of Ras, such as we have, and there's two up at Ballymurphy at the White Rock, and there's ones up further on towards Ballysillan. So that's where you had farming going right across the front of the hills. Then after that, you start to get the, one interesting aspect is you start to get the townland names, and you get the names from, well, Ballymurphy, Ballymagary, Ballysillan, Ballydownfine. Those are starting around the same time as the Raths, and they demonstrate how people viewed, from a cultural heritage point of view, how they viewed the hills. So you find that the upper sections are named after animals such as Alt na Key, Sleeve na Gravery, height of the woodcock. named after trees, Ballysillan, willow, Clockfern, right up to the north, is alder. But then further down, we then start to see names such as Ballymurphy, and then we start to get English names in like Andersonstown, Stewartstown, that are very much associated with ownership. So that's just a quick skirt through the different eras and some of the aspects of the cultural heritage of the Blackmount. I'm sure I've missed an awful lot there, Linda.
No, it's good, Jim. Yeah, it's good to recognize there's so much richness in the place names, you know, and just the importance of not losing that. Yeah,
we've lost some of the names. I mean, Black Mountain, we've got some hints as to some of the other older names that we have there, but it's a really interesting way of finding out how people viewed, because they named those sites for what they've seen as the important aspects of those sites. And particularly you start to get surnames coming in, obviously later on, and that, as I say, alluded to, suggests ownership. So that's quite important in terms of shaping how the hills are viewed.
I'll come back to the topic of ownership and property.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I just want to move on to Gerry next. Gerry, during your time as MP for West Belfast, you supported the campaign against the quarrying on Black Mountain, and you also pushed for the creation of a nature reserve and parkland on the hills. Can you tell us a bit about what was behind this campaign? Like, why was it important both to yourself and to the others involved? And perhaps how your own connection to the hills has developed over the years? You're just on mute there, Gerry. Can you press on mute, or can someone unmute Gerry?
You always get somebody to tell you when you're on mute. Well, be me a raga will my hand sasta. By Libsha and Octogus, Gormagat for you and Shans Conch, we Safety. Just to thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be part of tonight's discussion. I was trying to cobble together some notes and records, come back over the various efforts to get the hills adopted and put under public ownership. And I started to think about bits and pieces of when we moved into Ballymurphy first, and I don't know the exact year. And when you try to do a bit of last minute research like this, you realize that you should have been more diligent about it. But it must have been, 1958, 59. So if you think about that just for a second, those of you who know the place, Spring Hill wasn't there. Spring Hill was Husky's Field. In the middle of it, there was a big house, which was, when we were there, became a clinic. The river wasn't piped. The river between what's now Spring Hill and Ballymurphy, where the river goes below the road, which is just below the nursing home, beside the manse where the infamous Ballymurphy killings took place. The river was open, so we played in the river as kids and went on to the bridge. You could walk up. My yard wasn't in a state of development. You could walk up. There was a dam, which was an open dam, which was accessible. We went there often. There was a little tin church on the Mountain Lonan, just opposite Dermot Hill, not far from where Fergal's family live. West Rock was bungalows. They were they were put up temporarily. So it's a totally different place than it is now. I mean, the big estates like Ballymurphy and New Barnsley and so on, Turf Lodge. But even of a photograph taken by a man called Kevin McNulty, and it's a photograph through a gate, and there are two old Ulster piers at each side of the gate, and he's looking down, and there's nothing between where he is to St Thomas's School. It's all, obviously the graveyards there, but there was no housing when he took the photograph. We used to listen to corn crakes there when we were kids. Well, so that's the sort of existence we had, and we were always on the mountain. We were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right up until, you get interested in girls and other matters. You were always on the hills, just playing about, walking about. There were hares there at that time. The bluebells are almost, it must be of my generation. It's interesting to hear Fergal saying the same things. We're all part of our, I suppose, memories of childhood. And I've a book coming out in August, which I've called Black Mountain, and all those little memories of the hatchet field and the bluebells and the heather and the bracken and so on all come through in that. So when the Brits came in 69, it then obviously became more dangerous, and I think a lot of people stayed away from the mountain. Incidentally, the main way up the mountain was up the mountain Loney. And at the top of the mountain Loney, there was what we call the waterfall. It's actually just a fountain. It was just a spring well coming out of a rock. And that was the main way up the mountain. The farmer later on put a gate up, and you couldn't get up that way. But we would never have gone up the way we now go up when you go up to Divison and walk along the road. So the big campaign was around the quarrying. That's in my recollection what kick-started that. And one of the prominent people involved in that was Terry Enright Sr. And there were lots of other people, but Terry was the leader, I suppose, in many ways of that particular project. And when I was MP, we were very actively involved also in an effort to conserve the bog meadows and also the development of Cullen Glen. And there's a separate program in the saving of the bog meadows. But that's one of my little things that I'm proud of, because there was an effort to concrete it and to make it part of an industrial base. So we succeeded. Adrian Crean, who's part of your program, and Terry Goldsmith were some of the activists who formed the Friends of Bog Meadows. And we did a conference about land use in West Belfast. And we developed a plan to conserve the bog meadows and to conserve and to develop. And I have a note. Tell me if I'm speaking for too long, Linda, please. So we called for the mountain range from the Cullen Mountain across the Divison Black Mountains to Cave Hill to be declared a conservation area and developed as a nature reserve and a parkland. And we also convened. There's a lot of drag action involved around the quarrying and a lot of very, very good campaigning tactics used. But I went up one day and just knocked the door and asked to talk to the owners. And we eventually got a conference going, which they participated in. And out of that came an agreement. It wasn't entirely satisfactory from our point of view, but it stopped the quarrying in the end. And then the effort then to get the area made into a parkland intensified. And let me just I would miss my notes here. We as things moved, when I entered in 1991, so we asked for the British had taken over the White Rock Industrial Estate and other pieces of land which belonged to the local community. So we had a campaign to demilitarize the hills, but also to give that land back to the community. And Mo Molam, in fairness to her, was very progressive and very helpful in terms of those different efforts. And we also argued for the British Ministry of Defence to gift its site at Divis Mountain to the Belfast Hills Trust. And then I was engaged in different meetings and lobbying the British ministers, and later on there were two unionist ministers for the environment, Dermot Nesbitt and Sam Foster. Molam made the difference. There were all sorts of obstacles, all sorts of civil service didn't want to move and so on and so forth. So it was she who came back to us. She undertook to look at how this could be done. And she came back with a proposition about the National Trust. It was she who came back with that idea. And I used to meet her quite often out at Hillsborough on a Sunday for an hour or two, just quietly. We used to walk in the garden up there and talk about whatever crisis was going on at that moment politically, but it also gave me the opportunity to lobby on these projects. So if my notes are accurate, in 2003, in September, the National Trust bought Divis, and in June 2005, Divis and Black Mountain were designated as a conservation area under the ownership of the National Trust. And I think it's fair to say we haven't looked back, and the people and the mountain hasn't looked back since. So fair play to everybody that was involved.
And do you still get up into the hills, Gerry?
I do. Yeah, it's. I actually think the hills that are at the top of the street that I'm living in, and sometimes when you're in a lovely place and you say to somebody, "Is that a great view?" They'd say to you, "I can never pay any heed to it, or I never notice it." Right? I always notice it. And in this book that I'm bringing out, I have two old characters, and they're sitting, and one says to the other one, "Did you ever see an old dog lying, and it gets up and it stretches itself, and it yawns and it scratches itself, and it maybe gives a wee shake, and then it walks off? What would we do if the Black Mountain did that one day?" So I always notice the mountain every day. It's part of my DNA.
Great. Thank you, Gerry, for that. We'll come back to all the speakers later on, but I just want to move on now to Maria from League and Neil Improvement Association. And just want to ask Maria what the importance the hills hold for the communities you work with, especially over the last year and a half, like when feelings of isolation or disconnection have really surged due to the pandemic.
A hard question. I have two other people connected with my organization here today, so if I mess up, I'm sure they're gonna tell me where and how. So I'm just gonna kind of introduce myself first. I'm born and bred West Belfast, brought up in Glenveigh at the bottom of the Fhathaigh Hills. So all those areas and everything you're talking about, we've had family. So I kind of came to League and Neil about 21 years ago, and at that point in time, I wanted to bring you back to that because I've been there 21 years. And people who were there long before me saw the importance of the Belfast Hills. They saw the importance of keeping and preserving all of the ecosystem, the biodiversity and everything else that grew up in and around the mills, and the legacy that they left. So what I'm doing and what we've been trying to do for the last number of years, even before COVID, was to actually show people that there's a richness up there in terms of things, the kind of questions you've been asking, in terms of culture, in terms of built heritage, in terms of the biodiversity it's there, the wildlife is there. So we were lucky enough around about 2007 to harass a developer for long enough to give us one of his dams, so that we didn't have, so it wasn't filled in and we could preserve that. We were lucky enough then to cajole another developer to lease us another dam, and always with the eye to knowing that we in League and Neil were the central point for that linkage right across the Belfast Hills. So whilst we've been tottering about for the last few years and trying to make sure that the land remains within community ownership, and we look at those linkages, because the same stories that you guys are saying about West Belfast are the same stories that the North Belfast guys tell me, that there were always those passages up. Jackie Redpath will tell you as well, because we've had a conversation, see him here this evening. There have always been linkages, there have always been those trodden pathways that the communities have always put right into the hills from all of those directions. So for us, when we bought that site, and we got some funding, and we put a lot of the pathways in, and we looked at how we could, you know, ensure that this was in community ownership. That view always was, look, this is here for the community, this is here to eventually get that access. And pre-COVID, I would say that we put a counter on one of the gates, and we had about 2,000 people per month coming through that gate. During COVID, that went up to anything between 11,500 and 5,500 people per quarter going through those gates. So it multiplied immensely. With that comes its own problems and difficulties in terms of we're a small community organisation, we're maintaining a massive big space, and very little financial support or government support to do that. Now, what we have done, and we've sat and talked to a number of community activists, a number of political parties, and all different key stakeholders, and the general consensus is that from those communities that live in and around the hills, that need, that thirst, that appetite to get up there and enjoy it as much as possible is there and has been there for generations. The fact that it's not accessible on occasions due to, for example, some landowners not wanting you to cross their site, fear of litter, fear of antisocial behaviour, fear of criminal activities, you know, preventing them is something that we're having to deal with even during COVID. So for us, that connectivity is important. If you can walk, as we feel that you can, from Colin Glen, from even before Colin Glen, right up and over and across Divis, look at those things that Jim was talking about, the ring forts and the kilns and that history, and then you can at the top of that hill, at the top of Divis, you can choose to go in various directions then, as is your want. That's vital. And our chair, John Gray, who's also here this evening, has written a document on the Hills Access and our ongoing campaign to ensure that the community have access to the Belfast Hills and are able to kind of get involved with the campaign, enabling people onto the site so that they can enjoy just what you guys have actually said has been important to us throughout the years. I kind of had a conversation today with Jim and Aidan Crean, and I think the general consensus today is that most people love the hills when you have that hill to yourself, when you can enjoy the bluebells, or you can enjoy the scenery, you can enjoy the sun coming up. But isn't it shocking that you've got so many people on it wanting to enjoy it with you? So for me, you know, these kind of things are important. And one of the things that I think is key here is that community want to own this, community want to own, you know, that access, that they want to enjoy that, and for us too, though, it's preserving what's there as well. So our concern from our side is, I suppose, that when we sustain our environment site, the dams and the walkways and the paths, is that we also want to make sure that we keep that biodiversity, we keep that wildlife there, that we don't ruin nature just for the sake of getting into the hills. And for me, that's why people like Jackie and like Val and Jim are important to kind of ensure that we do. I've rants, that's my rant over, guys.
That's great, Maria, thank you. Yeah, I'll just move on to Melina next. So Melina's with the National Trust. Melina National Trust now owns a large area of Belfast Hills, and due to the paths and facilities the Trust upkeeps, it's enabled a huge amount of people, like as Maria was saying, the access, like the joy of being in the hills. So what further plans do you have for restoring the richness of the hills? Like, is rewilding an option? The story of Aaron and another young man capturing images of pine martens returning. Like, is there more rewilding to be done? And what potential do the hills have in helping us tackle the climate crisis as well, like in terms of carbon storage, but also in terms of addressing issues such as water security and flood risk?
Thanks, Linda, and thanks to Fergal for inviting the Trust along tonight. And so just a quick intro, yes, I'm the Nature Conservation Advisor for the National Trust. So I work very closely with the ranger team on Divis and across other sites that the Trust looks after. So yes, as everyone's well aware, and first of all, I'm not native, I'm not local to the site, I'm a culture. So I am just starting to get to know the hills. I've been with the trust 2 years, but I've married a West Belfast man and I've dragged him down to the sticks. So yeah, I'm looking to get more in touch with the hills through this work. So yeah, as you say, rightly say, Linda, the land that we look after, it's an amazing space for nature. We have blanket bog, we have upland heath, we have wildflower rich wet meadows, and our key goal is essentially to restore that site for nature and ensure that access is there. And we always think about looking at management of site for nature, carbon and people. So as you say, carbon is something that's on everyone's sort of minds at the minute. So the Trust is very keen to play our part in the nature and climate crises. So we have a really good handle at the minute on the types of habitats that are on the site, but we really want to understand the quality of them and how we can restore them. So at the minute, we're currently working with Queen's and RPS to look at the hydrology. So we want to understand how the water behaves on the surface and through the site, because we're well aware that there's been a series of drains installed across the bog, and we're keen to understand the impact those drains are having on the habitat. So we've embarked on a programme of monitoring the site for a year. And we're also well aware that the mountain is the headwater for rivers, which flow down, and some connect to the Lagan. So if we manage the site for nature and carbon, we could essentially provide benefits beyond our own boundaries and look at reducing flood risk downstream. When it comes to restoring nature on bogs, you want your water table to be quite close to the surface. You're talking about sort of 10 to 15 centimeters from the surface. You want that to be a very wet area. So we probably will look at restoring through blocking drains to ensure that the sphagnum, the mosses, keep that bog healthy. And in doing so, it captures carbon. Because if your bog is not healthy, it actively is emitting carbon. So we're really keen to look at that. And the company we're working with have done a lot of work in the south on raised bogs in the Midlands. So they have a lot of experience, and they're currently now working with, the men that were cutting turf are now helping to actively restore the bog. So they're using their knowledge of the site. So they have a lot of experience across the country. And I think it's very good to plug the fact that today is World Bee Day. It's always on the 20th of May. And again, Divis and Black Mountain provides a wealth of natural habitat, which provides a great food resource for our native bees, and also provides nesting habitat. So a lot of our native bumblebees like to nest in long grass. A big portion of our native bees are solitary bees. We've got 77 species of solitary bees in Ireland, and they need a nesting habitat. So that big chunk of land that we look after is providing a great resource for our bees. And also too, just while I'm thinking, TG Cahir have a really good documentary tonight at 9:30, which is talking about the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, with some great footage of allotments that we look after at Minnoburn. So yeah, 9:30 tonight would be a good watch. So yeah, I suppose in relation to your initial question, Linda, yeah, we're really keen to play our part in the nature and climate crises. Essentially, as a conservation charity, we kind of protect and care for places so people and nature can thrive. So we're really keen to support the work that is happening through the Belfast Hills and local associations. We do have a volunteer and community manager, Shanna, who I think Niall and Fergal know really well. So yeah, we're keen to support your campaign in whatever way we can.
Great, thank you, Melina. So my next question, final question before I open it up to the others to come in with your questions. And if you do have a question, please put it in the chat. And it'd be great if you could preface it with the actual word question so I can pick them out amongst just the comments. Yeah, so my final question is a bit long and challenging. So all of our speakers talked about, and it's great to recognize that the likes of the National Trust and like the Neil Improvement Association and the Ulster Wildlife Trust, who've just also bought land on the hills, have bought this land with a view to protecting the richness of life held within them. Which includes us humans who want to soak up a bit of like peace and tranquility that the hills have to offer. But what do you think about moving away from the idea of ownership and property altogether? The concept of property, as you'll know, is steeped in capitalism and tied to the notion that nature is there for the sole purpose of serving us. So what about reversing the process of enclosures, like decolonizing our relationship with our hills and reclaiming them as commons, or recommoning, if you like? Or maybe going further, perhaps, it'd be useful to consider the concept of recognizing the rights of nature itself to exist and to thrive. I guess humans have rights, and now even corporations have rights. So what about giving the hills rights? And can we change our story, like a story that underpins our relationship to the natural world, away from a possessive, extractive mindset, to one of belonging, equality, and care? So I said it was a long question, and I'll give our speakers a wee bit of time to think about it. And while you're thinking about it, I'm going to invite Colm to share his poem that was inspired by Colin Glenn. So over to you, Colm. You're on mute there, Colm. There you are.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Linda and, Fergal, etc. My name's Colin McGillivane. This poem, I dedicated this poem to Terry and Terry O'Kenright, given that they were two stalwart environmentalists, but I'm sure, and having heard other people speak, that there has been over the generations many people, who have been equally stalwarts, of the environment, etc. Anyone looking out their window today, or anyone fortunate enough to have been up on the mountains, will not see anything in this poem that reflects this. But here we go. Anyway, Colin Glenn. It was summer, great and good, in the early morning wood. A choir of birds announced the dawn. The chorus lingered on and on. Sweet perfume pervades the air. Insects hover here and there. The animals begin to stir as I offer up this simple prayer. Let it be like this everywhere, shall I?
Go ahead.
And Colm, thanks very much. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go back to our speakers and whoever wants to jump in with my previous question.
I'll jump in if you wish, just to kick it off.
Yes, please, Gerry, thanks.
Okay. Well, it's arguable that we wouldn't have the public ownership of the hills if it wasn't for the public. We wouldn't have the conservation of bog meadows or the Colin Glen if it wasn't for the public. That people cared, and people like Terry and others that Colin has mentioned made a stand and argued and so on. It's arguable that the quarrying would have continued and that the hills would have been even more vandalized than they currently are. So I'm a very firm believer in public space, including urban public space, that people can meet, that there can be trees, that there can be, I talked in my opening remarks about a field called Husky's Field. It always struck me, and this has stayed with me all my life, that was a green field. When they built Spring Hill, which is not the Spring Hill we have today, but when they built Spring Hill, they obliterated every single blade of grass, and they made it grey and they made it black. They were the two predominant colours in Spring Hill, grey brick and black tarmac. So I think people need to have ownership of their environment and nature. I mean, we're only a very small part of nature, and so far as we can, and as much as we can, we need to be continually opening up these public spaces, educating people, but allowing nature. It is quite possible for human beings and nature to live, you know, side by side, and both can thrive. And that's maybe not a direct answer to your question, because I don't understand the full, particularly in terms of the hills. It may be a different matter in terms of breaking up some big estate that's owned by a single person or a big corporation. That's one question, but these hills are now public space, and they're being developed by people who care, and so on. So I don't know how, you know, commonage fits into that notion. I do know how, I can't understand how commonage could fit into lakes and rivers and, as I say, big tracts of land which are owned by individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just say, where we're concerned, in a utopian society, it would be great if you know, the land was free and people could be encouraged to want to preserve it, to want to protect it, to be its caretakers, and to respect the flora and the fauna and the wildlife and everything else. Unfortunately, that's not the case. If you use the example of Ligony for one, I mean, massive amount of biodiversity and everything else grew up in and around the mill races, the dams, and so on. And unless the likes of Tom Lovett, who, you know, preceded me, the likes of John Gray, who's been campaigning for years, the likes of Jackie, who've been campaigning for years, to keep them maintained the way they are. I hadn't have done that, then you wouldn't have that. And that has to be about ownership, because you've got greedy people like the developer that we finally said, you know, convinced to give us the dam for, what was it, £2,000 in 2007. Had we have not have done that, we not have taken that into community ownership, and we see ourselves as representing the local community. And we did all of the legal stuff to ensure that happened. That dam was been filled in, then there would have been houses built on it. So whilst, you know, there's what we would have loved, and we still see, even though it's our ownership, we see that as a community facility, a community access point. It belongs to the local community. It's not closed off. It's open and accessible at all points in time. We encourage people to get involved. We encourage people to protect it. Significant amount of vandalism and damage done on site at different points in times, because when you depend on community to look after, and you say this is yours, look after it, not everybody has that same view. And the responsibility as a landowner then falls to you to preserve it, falls on you to do the repairs, falls on you to look after when they set fire to it, falls on you to look after when they destroy the hedgerows or the fencing that protects it, and protects, like, for example, we have quads that come on our site all the time. They've wrecked the fencing, which means that they are worrying that we've got swans up there, we've ducks up there, we've all sorts of things growing there. And it's that, you know, so I suppose my point is that unless we took ownership of it, unless we got that responsibility to look after all of that, who would do that? Who is going to do that? Because somebody, if it's not in that way, and we know this, you will have developers on site, and they will go up further and further into those hills. So yes, in a perfect world, it should be used. There should be nobody saying that's mine, that's private, that's whatever. Unfortunately, that's not what the world that we live in. We live in a world that where there are people looking at the hills and saying, I could build on that. You know, we have anecdotal stories of developers speaking to people and saying, I have X amount of land. It's supposed to be greenfield, but if you just nudge it into brown for us, and that happened in Ligony. That happened more and more, where land was scraped, biodiversity was done away with, natural habitats were ruined, because people scraped, because we couldn't, as a community, say we want this land and we'll purchase it. And we'll purchase it for the good of the community, for good of the wildlife, for good of the ecosystems. And that's the difficulty here. You have to fight against that, or challenge against that, or whatever. And do that, then you have to become, unfortunately, a landowner too. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, Maria. Bring Jim in. Do you want to come in there?
Yes, I do think that ownership is the crux of, for instance, one of the big conflicts that has been going since and before the start of the partnership has been between the rural farmers and the urban community. And it's about what people believe is theirs. There is a great view that the hills should belong to the people, the public. Technically, in terms of who owns ground, when you look at land registry, etc., the amount of public space has gone from about just a bit over a third. With the recent purchase of Colin Ward by the Woodland Trust, that's probably nudging closer towards 40%. But certainly some of the landowners, farmers, they see that land that they own as theirs. And that's part of the conflict. It's a conflict between how people perceive who owns and who has rights over that ground. We've got both farmers and community reps on board, so we've got representatives from both sides of that. So that's an important aspect of that. I just spotted a question in there about farming and wildfires. And you were mentioning rewilding, which obviously would suggest that that's a big ownership, a public ownership, for instance, and a push towards rewilding. A lot of the habitats that we have up in the hills, a lot of the wildlife that we have up in the hills is because of the way it's managed. When you go walking up on Divis, those cattle aren't there just to make a bit more of an income. Those are there to manage those areas. If they're taken away, and if the vegetation then grows, then you're going to be liable to more wildfires. So how do we, not just who owns the hills, but how do we manage the hills? And how do we manage the hills in the future when more and more people are going up to the hills? And the trick is going to be satisfying all those viewpoints and all of those needs and the way the land should be used. So how do we look after some of the key aspects? And I'd like to, I suppose Melina can come in about those sort of grasslands and areas that are managed by either grazing, cutting, etc., and some of the issues that we face up in the hills.
Yeah, I think that word rewilding can mean so many things to different people. Yeah. For us, in terms of trying to restore the peatland, to us that's a form of rewilding, trying to bring the peat bog back to what they naturally should be. And Jim's totally right in terms of the cattle. The cattle are there to graze the wildflower-rich wet meadows. If the cattle were not there, you would just get a dearth of grass and rush, which would smother all of the wildflowers. And the way that the cattle manage the site, they graze it, so you've got different heights across the landscape, which is fantastic for insect life and our native bees. And at one stage there was a marsh fritillary, a protected European butterfly. There was a record of it on the hills going back in the early 2000s. And there's always the hope that can come back again. So if you rewild and sort of stop all forms of management, you're creating a very different landscape, and you could lose a lot of the current interest. And yeah, increasing the fuel load, so to speak, and increasing the risk of wildfires. And I think that leads us on to the whole concept of, you know, we need to try to manage people and educate people. The more people we have in the hills, the more litter, the more disturbance to ground nesting birds. And a lot of our rangers, especially in the last year since lockdown, they want to do conservation work, but they're finding themselves, you know, picking up bags of litter on a daily basis. You know, that's what they've become. Some are in a really, you know, they're really down about the fact that they're not getting a chance to do proper conservation work. So there's a lot to do in terms of, you know, the sort of leave no trace and educating people on how to interact when they're out on the uplands, and try to keep dogs on leads when there's ground nesting birds. So yeah, it's a complex one. I think it'd be my summary.
Yeah, good summary. Yeah, thank you. There's just a couple of more questions, but I know some of our speakers have to go at 8:30, but we'll just tackle the first question that's come in there from Patricia. Is there a vision for future engagement of youth in a Belfast youth partnership that could provide the labour required for works mentioned by Maria? In Ontario, Canada, these types of initiatives were run for youth at risk. Funding for wages provided by federal government, and such initiatives give youth buy-in while serving their communities within the natural environment. So this type of initiative could eliminate future ASBs. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I think that's a good idea. I mean, most of the organisations which are managing the hills are preserving them, conserving them, and developing them. Are voluntary, or, you know, dependent on, you know, they don't have the type of funding that they deserve. But it certainly would be a very productive pathway to take to create the basis in which young people could be trained to be part of that necessary conservation work, that development work, learning about the hills and their history, but also a lot of the suggestions that Melina was talking about, you know, to train them into how to be rangers, if that's the way that they want to go. But even in the meantime, you know, repairing fences, planting trees, clearing rivers, and so on and so forth. I think that's a very good idea.
We're just coming to the end of one of our projects, our Bright Future, lottery funded, and the person that's running that said, listen, can we plant a tree for every young person that we've been working with? That's from 11 to 24. And I said, yes, and it's 12,000 trees. So that's, I know some of that is one-off, but we also do trainee ranger training courses, take people under our wing and get them to look at the practical aspects of how you manage sites, whether that's sites such as Divis. So very much like Gerry was talking, that's coming to an end. We're hoping that we get more money to do that. And that's not just trying to help young people get skills as far as practical aspects are concerned. That's also looking at how they can lobby, they can run campaigns. And that was actually, it was an idea that's part of it's a bigger scheme that the Lottery Fund have been pursuing. I think there's about 30 schemes altogether. And this was before young people got so invigorated, and still are, in terms of climate change. So it was quite forward thinking. And some of those people that have been involved from 5 years ago are now very, very active. So it's broadening all of that. Trying to do it further. We're in a different world. I suppose it's not hard to work out that things are going to be very different from an employment point of view, from a green recovery point of view. And we've got to be very careful that we promote for real jobs, as opposed to develop skills for jobs that aren't there. So it needs to be doing both. I was on a youth training scheme many years ago, so I understand, or it's a long time ago. But yes, there's some great people that have started off with just what might be seen to be fairly short-term training.
Can I just say I agree entirely with Jim? This has to be for real jobs, and it also, I mean, these different projects need to be, it needs to be mainstream funding, and not, a lot of people involved in voluntary and community work spend an awful lot of their time trying to put together a cocktail of funding, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are real assets, and it's even bad economics because, if a young person who could contribute so much to this is just left on the dole, or just left figuring about, or unfortunately falls into bad luck or bad ways, then it all becomes a burden on the state as opposed to being a contributor to the well-being of society. So I agree entirely with Jim. It shouldn't be, what we've seen so many times before. It should be for proper jobs, and it should be mainstreamed.
And when you take young people, or anybody up, but particularly young people and young primary school children up, even if you only take them up a couple of times, I've been doing this long enough that I have adults coming to me saying, "You let me up around Oxford Island," or "Terry let us up the hill," and I've always thought of that place differently ever since then. So even short term, giving people a chance to get up there and to appreciate it can make a tremendous difference.
Yeah, great, Jim. Thank you. No, Gerry, you have to head off now.
Okay. So Slán Gurmagat, Linda, thank you, everybody. Good luck. Keep up the good work.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Gurmagat. Okay, so if the other speakers don't mind sticking around a wee bit longer, we've just got a couple more questions here through the chat. So we have Alona, I think that's or Alona Lisa, is it? And maybe invite you to come in and ask the question. And
yes, I mean, sorry, I'm not from Belfast. I'm from the Basque Country, from a place called Bilbao. But I lived in Belfast and worked in Belfast for 4 or 5 years, teaching architecture and planning. So I'm quite close to the city, both in terms of my research, but also in terms of understanding the city as an international city. Really, I'm an architect by training. And I worked many years ago with a group of architects, Kieran Muscail and other people in Belfast, trying to take Belfast to Italy. So it's close to my heart. And I think my question, if I go back to it, there was a couple of points, and I'm looking at this from an outsider, maybe not. One of them is, and let me find the question, is can you not set up like an agency where all the stakeholders, all different landowners, which obviously would not agree in little groups, or farmers and other people, to try to coordinate all of that land in order to manage it, and also in order to take care of it, to take care of the management of the space, of the natural space, because the more people that use the hills, and I mean the hills are Belfast and Belfast are the hills. Anytime that you arrive to the city, when you see the hills, you recognize immediately that you are in Belfast and you're not anywhere else at all. So we had a similar problem in Bilbao in the late 80s, when the city was completely in a dispersed situation, both economically and socially. And what they had a problem with the land in the whole sites by the river, Nervión, they basically had a lot of opportunity areas that were really, nobody gave a damn about them. We had funding problems, political problems. So what they did is they created an agency, which is now dead, called Bilbao Ria 2000, to try to manage all of these spaces. And then my second question is related to mental health. Like you were mentioning the youth. I think that's a great idea, because if you can get the young people involved in managing the hills, in planting trees, in that kind of stuff, and you could get a government grant or a national lottery grant that can help unemployment and depression, and a lot of issues that are becoming more apparent with the pandemic, particularly if you take the statistics in the north of Ireland are stagnant, and I think that could be a really good space for people to switch off, basically. So that's my questions to the panel, in a way. What are your thoughts about that? And maybe the example of Bilbao could be useful in Belfast, because they're similar places, similar cities, and I think, so thank you very much. That's a lot. I'm sorry, I came from the outside. I'm not Irish. I feel Irish, but I'm not Irish. So, forgive me for stepping in like this. I live in England, but anyway, thank you.
Can I start? Sorry, can I start answering that a wee bit, and then Jim, and then possibly John?
Yeah, thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. Right, so John Gray is here this evening. Jim, Jackie Redpath, and so on. There's a number of us here who've been involved. Some of those longer than have a lot longer than me. Who have for years questioned why there isn't a united kind of endeavour to link the Belfast Hills and to look at land ownership and how people can access it whilst maintaining it effectively. John has done a document, and it's almost like a call to arms to people within the communities around the Belfast Hills to start to push more for those access and to identify and to challenge people to identify access points into the hills. And we've successfully lobbied council sufficiently that they have been instructed to write a report as to how we can actually make this happen. And that will, and we envisage a partnership that will take account of every landowner on the hills and to look at how we work together to ensure that there is access. And some of the conversations are really just starting because we want to make sure that all communities in and around the foot of the hills are engaged in that, all can have their interests effectively met, but then also that those people who maybe feel threatened about access to the hills, such as the farmers and so on, that we can actually persuade them by some way that we're not, that we're not going to be a threat to livestock, that there's not going to be additional antisocial behaviour, that there's not going to be quads up there and destruction of property and so on. And so there's a lot that we need to be taken in. But first and foremost, that focus is on that right of access, from all of the communities that surround the Belfast Hills. And we want to promote it. You're 100% right. We want to promote it. There are spots on the hills that are absolutely gorgeous. And there is access from all areas of Belfast and outside of Belfast that have been there that, for centuries. And again, you want to promote that. So if you look at, the cultural aspects of it, you've got everything from Neolithic heritage right through to Iron Age, right through to the cultural heritage. For example, in Ligonene, for example, we have Nietzsche O'Hartran, who was the last highwayman in Belfast to be hanged in Carrickfergus. We have the last Wolf of Ireland that was supposed to have been, killed within Ligonene. You have the United Irishmen history, you have World War II, you have the Game of Thrones, if you want to take it even more modern. So there's reasons, that was your next question, why you want to go to the Belfast Hills. Game of Thrones. But there is that concerted effort now. There is an appetite from all of those communities to want to work together to do that. But we have also, from my perspective, what the reason why my community got involved in the first instance was the preservation, was enhancement. And that's just of all of those things, of the physical aspects of our side of the hills, of the community, of the folklore and the culture. But whilst promoting the hills, by saying to people, this is a gorgeous place you want to go. And more and more, when I walk our site, and I do it once or twice a week, you will have people from different parts of Ireland, from different countries up there and asking, how do I get onto the Belfast Hills? Where, show me that link from your site to where I need to go to get to Divis. And that's massive. So there are the things that we kind of want to promote, want to show that people have that appetite, and yes, build on that. And I think the fact that council now recognise that there is a need, there is that appetite to have those openings, to have that access, and actually have agreed to do that report. That's the first and major step.
Okay, do you want to come in there, Jim? And then after that, I'm going to invite Aaron Kellyan to tell us about his discovery of the Pine Martens and his other great work. So yeah, but just you can finish that.
It's
Jim.
In a way, the partnership that I'm involved in goes a small way towards what you're doing, but really it's about statutory power, about powers. We don't have powers. Even amongst, for instance, the environmental organisations such as the National Trust, Ulster Wildlife, if we if we said, right, this is the way you should manage your wildfires, or this is the way you should manage grazing, they've got their own policies, etc. So yes, I've actually been looking at Bilbao in the past. Also, Vitoria is another city just south of Bilbao. Looking at them as possible partners and lessons that we can learn. Barcelona, from a wildfire point of view, they've got a fantastic a track record as far as that's concerned. So a lot to learn as far as that's concerned. I'm very aware that we haven't really answered your mental health question, but I think we'll let Aaron go and then maybe come back to that, I suppose, Linda.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a good idea, Jim. Okay, so I'd just like to invite Aaron then to tell us a wee bit about what you do.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. No, not anymore.
So in terms of the Black Mountain, there is a way that you can have this, what is just for the animals and what is just for nature. There's free landowners up there, and they've all agreed that they'll be happy for an organization or some type of, or a lot of people to work on that mountain, cleaning it, planting trees, looking after it, and doing conservation. So they have no problem with that. In terms of the hills itself, it's completely accessible the whole way through. You've got Count Glen, it's opened up. You've got Lamderg, it's opened up. You've got Divis Mountain Walk, it's opened up. Cave Hill's opened up. Carmoney Hill's opened up. And when these people come, it's not really, it's getting open for nature, but it's not necessarily for nature. We're opening up for ourselves. And I think with the Black Mountain, really we can do massive work on it without it being completely owned by the likes of a conservation organization, because all these free landowners agree. They've already agreed to let us plant on the mountain, and they've given us a huge amount of land we can do that. So I feel like with the Black Mountain itself, you could create an organization up there looking after it. And so you have conservation working on it. Secondary with that is education. You can educate the public on it. And then thirdly, you can create volunteer schemes, which you were talking about jobs. You can give people around the whole West Belfast who don't necessarily have anywhere close to do this. Like when I was younger, if I wanted conservation experience, I had to go far off to do it. So if we could create something around here where we can get local people in and get them interested, getting them wanting to do the job, not think environmentalism is weird, not think it's just get normal people really interested in it and bring them up and give them a valuable experience. What it was so hard for me to get because I had to travel so far from it. So in terms of the Black Mountain, I feel like it can be looked after completely. But I think instead of opening up for ourselves, we need to open it up in a way that this is just for the animals, you know, because we've got everywhere else on the hills for ourselves. And even with the Black Mountain, accessibility, the access is there. There's nothing stopping us from going on that mountain. And farmers allow us to. And they all like us. They like us going on the mountain. They like us taking an interest. But it's secondary what comes with that, and what your other woman was saying about what's going to come with that. When people come, the animals leave, and that's a fact. When people come, everything will move off. And I think this is really, we should try create this place for something which is just put a step ahead of everything else. What everyone else does is we do it for us. Why not just make it for the animals? And then secondary comes us, what we can bring on with education, volunteering experience, and everything else. And people can still go on hills because people go up the Black Mountain all the time. There's nothing stopping them, you know? So that's what I really think about all that, because there is work going to happen soon. And Jim will tell you, we've got agreements to get the planning with the Wheatland Trust and the council. So there's a lot of work going to be getting put into the place. And I think if we open it up, it's just going to get trafficked, and it's going to be a massive mistake. It may not be a massive mistake at the start. It's going to be great. A lot of people are going to be able to go up this mountain and walk and clear their heads, which is great. But is it really worth scaring away all the wildlife? You know what I mean? That's wildlife what you barely see anywhere else. You go up there early in the morning, you'll see more there than you'll see in Cave Hill. And that's a fact. I go up early all the time, and the amount of wildlife is ridiculous. And the reason for it is because it's not there. You have the middle of the mountain. I've surveyed this whole mountain. The middle part is where the track is, where people go up to the Hatchetfield. There's not one set or den on that middle part. You go to the left and the right, and then that's where all the dens are. So you have more people going up. It's just going to flood everywhere. It's going scurving away. But that's really what I think about. There's a way you can do this with working with the landowners, and that's really what I'm saying. Maybe if a path is done, leave it the way it is, and just maybe put wooden beams at the top of the mountain, like the way to do it in Fermanagh Boardwalk. You go up to the top, and then 3 wooden beams with arrows, and you follow that to the Davis Mountain Walk or something like that. Because really, I feel like this is really the last wee pocket we have on these hills for the wildlife to kind of be just left alone. And I don't know if I don't have it on paper, but I see it with my eyes. I'd be up there enough to see it with my eyes, you know. So that's really what I think about that. And in terms of the pay, Martin, I think we're up to 7 individuals now running around. So I found them in Lambdor, Colin Glen. I found them in Cave Hill. So I haven't done Carmona Hill, but I'm guessing I could easily say they're there because they're everywhere else in the hills. And this is it's just and they're learning us to do conservation on it. Like one Martinez, I want to make oil boxes up there. She's saying yes, make oil boxes. I want to put feed stations up there. Yes, you can do that. I want to make a pond on our land to have the newts have more places to breed. That's no problem, or go ahead. So it's easy to work with these places. I just feel like what they don't want is loads of people coming up to their land, like flat out and wrecking it. And if it is who's going to own it? Is it going to be the council? Because the council's land is stinking. I've seen the Falls Park. Have you ever seen the rivers? Or they're just littered, like. And then if it's going to be owned by the council, it's going to be looked after the same way the Falls Park is, or is it going to be looked after and is it going to be better? What you need is an organisation up there which is looking after it, up there every day, litter picking, doing conservation every day on it, working with partner organisations like the Ulster Wildlife, National Trust and Belfast Hills, and really just promoting this place for the wildlife. And secondary comes us. That's what I think anyway.
Yeah. Aaron, I think yes, you're raising the crux of how you manage land. The more people you get in, the more of a compromise, at the very least, you're making from a wildlife point of view. So yeah, you're making a very strong case that you cannot just increase access and assume that the wildlife's going to stay here. It just doesn't happen that way. And that's one of the reasons we're doing it from a landscape point of view, right across, perhaps even beyond the Black Mountain. They thinking in the past about environmental habitat management and sites was that you create areas that people are less likely to go to or don't go to, and then you have places that are, let's face it, sacrificed. Certainly in terms of where you have the car parks, the buildings, the toilets, and all that. That is sacrificed. So yeah, there is no easy answer to that, and those who push for access have to address your concerns. Whether you have a very narrow path or whether you don't have a path at all, that's part of the conversation. But this is, and Linda, you were talking about how this relates to global. It's the same in so many other places, that with the growth of not just our population, but our demand for land, there's less and less space for wildlife. And we have to face that both from a global point of view and from a Black Mountain point of view. So I don't have any easy answers, but we at least need to be very aware of our impacts. I'm glad to hear that in Lambderg. Aaron, I didn't know you were looking up there.
I'll send you a picture through. To be fair, it's actually just a conifer, but I think there's too much foxes in the area. But besides that, there's a few. So
well, that's the beauty of wildlife. You have to. Yeah, they're all there, I suppose. But yes, I understand that. Yeah.
And also got some great lots of agreement with the other Aaron in the chat.
Yeah.
And I think we're pushing on here in terms of time. So I'm going to, unless any of the speakers have any burning final comments, I'm going to pass back over to Fergal. So is there any final words that any of our speakers want to make? No.
Well, I'll just mention one quick thing, and that's I think Aaron alluded to, our push for woodland. We've got so little woodland in Ireland in general, and we're, fingers crossed, we're hoping to make some changes to that, and that will not necessarily mean access, but there's a balance there. Okay.
Just one final point for me too. Just very interesting to hear Aaron's point of view. And he mentioned something about, you know, conservation being inclusive, and I think that's a very important point. Sometimes conservation can be seen as being quite a specialist sort of subject, but I think everyone has an interest in nature and there's a real desire to learn. And I think young people, especially through the climate strikes, have shown they're really concerned. So I think, you know, that education is a big part of it. People want to know what they can actually do. What can they do in an individual level to help with the nature and climate crisis? So the more information we can provide in a local context, I think the better.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how hard a person thinks he is. Do you know if he sees a big buzzard flying over top of him? No matter who you are, you're going to love it. You're going to gain an interest. You just need to show them.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter who you are or how hard you think. You see that buzzard flying over your head, and you'll be like, "That's class."
Absolutely.
Brilliant, Darren. Thank you, and thank you to all our speakers as well, and Gerry, even though he's not here anymore. So, and thanks to everybody for coming along, and hopefully maybe this is the continue this conversation on about how we look after our hills and our communities, really. So yeah, thanks to everybody, and back over to Fergal.
Melina, Margaret, Linda, I think you all agree that Linda did a fantastic job in chairing what was a great discussion. And Linda had also taken part in an event that we did 2 Bluebell festivals ago on the rights of nature. So I was glad, Linda, that you raised that point again. And I think it's kind of internationalized the conversation that we're having here in terms of the wider issues at a global scale and how we can act on that locally, which has been very much the cause of Phil and the Gligany Gorma. And we're really overjoyed to have Aaron in, and Aaron brought our young people up the mountain on Tuesday when the weather wasn't quite as wet, and he did it into the Wild event. It was the last an hour, and he lasted about 4 hours. As Aaron, as you can tell, was enthusiasm. We had to cancel this evening, so we'll be doing that again in a few weeks' time. And we're hoping to build on this conversation. We're also hoping to do a documentary, a small documentary about the mountain, and Martin Keenan, who has shared some of his images in the chat room at the beginning, is gathering images on this. So if people would like to contribute to that, the community has some pics from Jim and from ourselves in that, and we're hoping to build on that the time ahead. So as Linda was saying, this is an ongoing conversation with Pete Mullen in the house as well, who is working as a landscape architect on some of the issues that Aaron was talking about. So this is a live issue that we're grappling with as a community, and it's great to see that at the COVID, as Maria was saying, has really opened up. I mean, where I live at the bottom of the Loney here, it's just been, we have been just inundated with people walking the mountain, people from across the world, people from India, from China. I meet them now, and they're accessing, as Aaron was saying, they're already accessing the mountain from our side, from the Balmerfee end here, and long may that continue. And I think that there's a real hunger and a thirst to be out in nature, and I think that this is the perfect time, the pertinent time to be having these conversations and to be building on this in the time ahead. So our Fhathaigh and Gligany Gorma is wrapping up on Saturday here, and we're hoping, as I say, to build on this in the time ahead. So thank you all. I think if we can give people who spoke a bill of bus, you can put yourselves off mute if you want. Well
done, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we've recorded this as well. Akarja, and anybody who has registered that Eventbrite will receive the YouTube video on Eventbrite, and we're hoping to put this out next week. And if anybody has missed it, you're free to share it far and wide. Thanks very much.
More, Stan.